Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. In survey after survey, year after year, people rank education as their top priority. Yet election after election, school systems struggle to convince voters to pass levies to pay teachers and buy books, or bond issues to build and care for school buildings. 2 years ago, a group of smaller school districts throughout the state banded together to challenge Ohio's reliance on local real estate taxes to fund schools. 3 weeks ago, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled in favor of the struggling districts, ordering the Ohio legislature to spend the next year developing a new system to fund the schools. That ruling infuriated state leaders. Governor George Voinovich, House Speaker Joanne Davidson, and Senate President Richard Finan vigorously defended their record and rejected the idea they need the courts to tell them what the right thing to do is.
So it's $600 million that we recognize. We have school buildings out there that are not adequate, and we're doing something about it, and we're moving expeditiously on it.
To discuss where we stand on the issue of the future of state funding, I am joined this morning by two people. Mike Fox, a Republican, represents Butler County in the Ohio House of Representatives. Representative Fox is the chairman of the House Education Committee. Joe Epplen has been the superintendent of Mount Healthy Schools for 6 years. Welcome to Newsmakers.
Glad to be here.
Mike, where do we stand right now? What has the Ohio Supreme Court ordered the state legislature or the state executive branch to do?
Well, the Ohio Supreme Court has basically defined this issue as one about money, about a state system versus a local control system, and about where should the disputes over the quality or adequacy of education be settled. And they said that basically quality of education is defined by how much money you spend. It is not a local controlled system, which we have had a long tradition of having a partnership with local communities. It is a state system only. And finally, they said that if there's a dispute about whether something is right or wrong, it shouldn't be resolved by the legislature, it should be resolved in the courts. Now, that model in the federal system hasn't worked too well. The federal court started intervening in urban districts around this country some time ago, and those of us that have watched that experience are concerned about that. About the other issue is about saying that it's just one dimension. The quality of education is just about money. I mean, money's important, but more important than that is what you do with the money. It's also about tax capacity. In other words, the poor districts, for example, that brought this lawsuit, one of the poorest in the state, Perry, which was the lead plaintiff, in the lawsuit, in spite of the fact they spend $3,000, $4,000, some cases $6,000 less per pupil than some of our wealthier districts, their high school graduate rate, the ones that pass the 12th grade proficiency test, they're in the top 100 schools in the state. So with less money, they're getting more value. So the other three dimensions that the court didn't talk about is, does community effort count? In other words, should some communities get off easy, if you will, if their taxpayers won't support their schools? Should stewardship count? In other words, if you take care of your buildings, I mean, does that count for something? And what about results? Do they count? I think it's about not only the money, but how you spend the money, stewardship, community effort, and capacity and results.
Joe, Mount Healthy, was your district part of this suit? Did you join this suit?
Yes, we did.
And from your perspective, the ruling that the Ohio Supreme Court has come down with, is this what you hope for? And then we'll get secondly to the way that Representative Fox just characterized that ruling. But is this the ruling that you were hoping for?
Yes, I think that I felt confident, really, that the Supreme Court would rule in favor of our kids. This system, the formula has been around for since 1935. And while I think the legislature has spent a great deal of time prudently thinking about ways to enhance and improve the quality of life in our schools, we have patched and added things to that particular formula, and that formula is really outdated.
And when you say formula, do you mean specifically the funding formula, the money side of this?
That's correct. That's correct. I mean, it's like taking Saturn parts and putting it on a Studebaker. It's not equipped to do that. It'll run for a while, but there are things that are wrong with that formula. and it needed to be fixed.
Now, the argument that was just put out here is that this decision focused everything on money and did not pay attention to issues of quality, community involvement, etc. Do you agree with that analysis, that this is a too narrowly focused decision?
It is fairly narrowly focused. I'd have to grant that. At the same time, however, just because a person lives on one side of a street and goes to one school district versus another side of the street and goes to another school district and has more opportunity in another district just from a financial base, I think it creates problems for those of us that live on the wrong side of the street. In this state, there are school districts that pay $4,000 per pupil. There are school districts that pay $12,000 per pupil. And I would venture to say that although Mr. Fox can cite the Perry County situation as being the upper 100, that there are an awful lot of schools that, because of the financial background that they've had, are doing exceedingly much better than some of the poor districts.
On this question of local control versus state funding, and you paralleled it with the federal, in fact, though, I mean, the federal government involvement in local education, dollar-wise, is 5%. It's relatively small. The state is constitutionally responsible. The state is, in effect, local control of education. That's a state responsibility. Isn't that the case?
Well, it depends on how you define it. The answer is yes, and the way it works is kind of like, some folks say what's yours is yours, or what's yours is mine, and what's mine is mine. And the state is given the constitutional authority to be in charge of school systems. And I don't think anyone's quarreling with the court decision in that regard. And frankly, I agree with what Joe said, is that those of us who have been at this for a while, no one's defending the formula, no one's defending the inequities in the system. Even the defendants in the case, which was cited by the court, said, yeah, those things exist, and the question is, where do you work them out? How do you resolve? Is the courts the right forum to do it, or is it the legislature?
You know, this is one of the things that confuses me. I'm confused as to why people were so put out by this decision. Everybody's been waiting literally for months for this decision to come down. Everybody knew these funding discrepancies existed. Everybody knew what had happened in 18, 19 other states with similar sorts of suits. Why was there such a seemingly a surprise and strong reaction? I guess I was expecting the Supreme Court to make its ruling probably along these lines, and everybody to say, well, it's going to be tough, but let's dig in.
I think there was the expectation among most legislators and the leadership that the courts would find the building part, the infrastructure part, unconstitutional. What surprised most of us was the courts basically said two things that are inconsistent. They said, well, the legislature is responsible for it, but if you don't like what they've done, come and talk to us and we'll come up with something better. And they created this, in effect, education czar. The person responsible for school districts in Ohio is Judge Linton Lewis, elected by less than residents, 30,000 residents, 4 school districts of less than 11,000 kids. He's in charge of Ohio schools. So I guess if we want to know, well, what works, and the other thing about the court decisions, they didn't give us any guidance. They said, well, we're not saying you can't spend more on one kid than another. We're not saying you can't do this. Basically, they said, we don't like the system, but we're not telling you that anything about the system that we found wrong is really wrong. It's okay to have those discrepancies. And we said, okay, well, what's the point here other than a political statement of we don't like it, which we all agree with? None of us like it.
Well, given that, Joe, what do you, and not just you individually, but what do educators, superintendents, what are some of the proposals that you would like to see seriously considered by the state to change the system? What are the alternatives that the education people would like to see?
Well, Mike mentioned infrastructure. I think that's a big one. I think it's important to accept the fact that it's a $10 billion problem and it's not going to be solved by one stroke of the pen in 1 year. It's going to have to be something that's spread out. The number of expenditures that involve special education students is a major issue. I think that it's important that maybe the money follow the student rather than simply because a child moves into your district with special needs, that all of a sudden that triggers an awful lot of things that you didn't have to plan for. Some states...
Most of your colleagues would not agree with the idea that the money should follow the student. I love that idea.
Okay.
I think that is a fundamental principle, but most of the Education Association, the School Board Association, superintendents would say, no, and this is one of the paradoxes of the decision. You say, no, the money shouldn't follow the student. It's the school system where the money should go, and now we've got this this paradox.
But you know, when a special needs student moves into my district and needs this, and we need to spend $23,000 a year simply to transport him to another school district because that's who has the program, I can't anticipate the $23,000.
I agree with you.
So, you know, I think that's something that could be considered. I think the transportation is an issue. There are some states that pay for buses on an equitable basis rather than coming out of school funds. Right. There are some states that have a cadre of architects so that when you're building new buildings, there are 4 or 5 models to build so you don't have to constantly reinvent that wheel. I think those are some things that need to be looked at.
But do those get at that basic issue of the operating levy? Now, for special education, you've
Right.
touched on that.
Right.
But for the operating and whether that is going to come from local real estate taxes or come from someplace else, what about that? What do you suggest the state do about that?
Well, there's a 920. We could talk about 920. You've talked a lot about 920.
That's
in the
taxpayer
past.
protection.
It's a taxpayer protection law, but in Mount Healthy, as an example.
Explain what that is. Most of us don't know.
920 was designed so that there was not inflationary growth for real estate taxes for schools.
So as the value of a house goes up, your taxes actually stay the same, and
roughly
therefore
the
your
same.
rate falls.
That's
Well,
correct.
except that there are exceptions to all that.
Well, yeah,
But
that's
get into all the
exception.
technical.
Sure,
By and large,
sure.
school per pupil spending in schools in this state has gone up at a greater rate than inflation.
Well, but
that's a fact.
let's stay with the real estate tax here.
But let's just use Mount Healthy as an example.
Okay.
Our voters have voted themselves over 50 mills of voted millage. I can only collect on 29 mills of that because of the rollback.
But let me ask you something, Joe. In that case, what about a community that says, we don't want to go that high? So, and let's take Cleveland, for example, where we spend millions of dollars, and they probably get $2,000 more per pupil than you get in Miami, in Mount Healthy. Now, but they make, as a state average, 75% of the effort. His taxpayers have said, we value education, we're willing to support it, we're willing to put in. Now, they let the buildings fall apart in Cleveland. They don't fix them. They got $1 billion worth of repairs. They have not they don't have 1 penny set aside for building renewal. Now, you take care of your buildings, that community doesn't. Are we saying that stewardship doesn't count? Forget all that. Let's go in, bail them out, give them the money, then the unions will come to the table, beat the school board to death, pull all the money out, and all of a sudden, his community's supporting him. Now they're supporting 2 systems.
But who passed the collective bargaining bill, though? You talk about the
I
union.
voted against the
Who
way.
passed the collective bargaining bill? It was the
voted against
legislature
it.
that
Well,
did
before
that.
we get off on that, though, let's stick to funding and taxes. I know it's related to contracts, but the other thing that a district like Mount Healthy faces, and one of the reasons I asked Joe to be here today, is they're a district that doesn't have much of an industrial base. What they have is residential property,
Right,
by and large.
Right.
And actually, a major portion of it is relatively older and not going up in value that quickly. I mean, this is a older community, et cetera, et cetera. So you face some real problems of, even no matter what your millage is, you don't have much to tax.
That's right.
So you may not be Cleveland, and you may be trying hard, but you've got your own set of
But that's why
problems.
tax effort is important. In other words, you can figure that in with
But-
if
but
you
what should
don't
the
have the
state-
capacity. And what the state should do is first off, we're going to have to take more of the money into a pot, which many of us have argued for years. But when you think about school districts rather than kids, you find lots of resistance to that. The districts like Princeton, for example, that
Okay.
is very happy to have a nice industrial base
Right.
that they keep locally in Tri-County Mall, et cetera. They don't want to give that up, so every time we've tried to blend it and make a bigger pot, those districts come in, talk to their legislators, and it becomes at an impasse. So, you know, I think Mount Healthy is a good example of a school district where they deserve the help.
Joe, when you meet with the superintendent at Princeton or at Sycamore, what do you say to them? What do you say to the people who have a lot of tax base?
Well, you know, you're kind of envious, obviously.
But can you say to them, can you sit across the table and say to them, in justice, you ought to be helping support the education of all the children in this metropolitan area and not just the ones that happen to be defined in your artificial boundaries?
No, I can't say that.
You can't say that.
I can't say
Well,
that.
but that's what he's at. I mean, that's what the legislature's being
So you're
asked
asking
to
the
say.
state to do that?
That's right.
And I don't have a problem in doing that, but when you start rounding that up and you get into the other issues about what are we supposed to do at the state level, what the court's basically saying is, look, you just give the money to the locals, let them decide what if they want to spend twice what he spends for a teacher salary in the district, send them the money. Basically, the courts have put us responsible for paying, but they haven't talked about, well, who's responsible for making sure? Does it matter how well the money's spent? Does it matter that Cleveland spends $80,000 for a janitor? Do you spend $80,000?
No, I don't spend $80,000 for a
should
janitor.
we be called on to say, well, let them spend $80,000. Let's send them some more money.
We're almost out of time. I've got two quick questions here. Realistically, practically, are a year from now we looking for an increase in sales tax?
I think you're going to see an increase in sales tax on the ballot, and whether or not we have it or not, we'll have to see whether the whole package. And I think to put more money into this system without saying we have to fundamentally reform it to where the money follows the kids, and it's a kid-centered education program rather than a school district education-centered program. If we don't do that, I think that we'll be back on the ballot again and again, because I think the public wants some changes in the results. They want performance for the money.
And Joe, I know I'm almost out of time, but you're facing a levy in just a few weeks, is that right?
That's right.
What immediate impact does this decision have?
Well, it's difficult to say at this point. I think that people feel that because a decision was made, it's going to be a quick fix, and we've tried to tell people it's not going to happen that way.
Well, there's no quick fixes and there's no quick answers, and we're out of time. Thank you. We're going to have you back because this is going to be a continuing issue in the next year. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It seems like 1997 is the year of floods. In March, the Ohio Valley was inundated. Small communities like Falmouth, Kentucky were submerged to record levels and changed forever. Now, melting snow and relentless rain are flooding the upper Midwest, threatening flooding along the Mississippi Valley. Join me after the break when we talk with the author of a new book about a flood 70 years ago that fundamentally changed America. Welcome back. Images of families driven from their homes by raging waters are still sharp in all of our minds. Those most immediately affected by the flood of '97 will be coping with its aftermath for years. But the impact of flood goes far beyond their effect on individuals. And according to a new book, Rising Tide, no flood has had greater impact than the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. The author of Rising Tide is John Barry. Mr. Barry has written for Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Esquire. He is also the author of The Transformed Cell, which has been published in 12 languages. Welcome to Newsmakers, John.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, around here, when people think about the big one, and floods have been on our minds a lot recently, we think about 1937.
Right.
1927, what kind of flood are we talking about? What sort of magnitude?
Well, it killed people from Oklahoma to West Virginia. It flooded 32 cities and towns in Kansas, 8,000 square miles in Kansas alone. But the real devastation was on the lower part of the river from Illinois to the Gulf of Mexico. In that area, not counting Kansas, Ohio, Pittsburgh flooded, 27,000 square miles on the lower river alone, and that's approximately the equivalent of New England without Maine. But it made a total of 1 million people homeless. That approached 1% of the total population of the country.
And how does that compare to the 1937 flood?
Well, the 37 flood, of course, was the greatest flood on the Ohio, and that was a devastating flood. But in terms of total scope, the disaster, 27 would still dwarf it, and the political repercussions, of course, of 27 dwarf really almost anything else that's happened in the United States.
And that's sometimes when, especially right now, when we're in the midst of dealing with the reality of the flood itself, thinking about the political implications, and that's what I find fascinating about your book. You move beyond just what happened physically. What are some of the most important political and social implications that resulted from that flood?
Well, the most obvious was a complete change in flood control policy in the United States, a 180-degree reversal. For example, there had been no reservoirs. The Corps of Engineers had opposed reservoirs, among other flood control features. And after the 27 flood, they started building them, many of them on the Ohio basin. It ended really the rule of the Southern aristocracy. It ended a way of life in the South. It helped bring in Huey Long. But nationally, it shifted the population of African Americans from the Mississippi Delta. A great surge of the black migration. It didn't begin it, but there was a tremendous surge.
Surge because
Their lands had been completely devastated. Everything they had was washed away. And it had direct impact on presidential politics and the New Deal even.
Well, I was going to say that one of the things I find interesting right now, people are talking about FEMA. People are talking about other things the federal government is doing in this area to help flood victims. In 1927, what was the attitude that the federal government ought to do in that area?
Let me say there were 700,000 people fed by the Red Cross, many of them for months, and the federal government, which had a surplus that year, not a deficit, did not spend a single dollar on any of them. But Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Commerce, was put in charge of coordinating the voluntary donations to the Red Cross and seeing that they were delivered. And you know how much even this flood made the front pages all across the country. 1927, 1 million people homeless. It lasted for months. It's on the front pages for a much longer period, and Hoover was on the front pages every day with it as a hero. And the opportunity did not escape him. He was a very ambitious man, and he used the media to create his presidential candidacy. In fact, James Carville is reviewing the book. I didn't know him prior to this, but he called me last week, and he told me that Hoover had a better press operation than any politician he knows today.
Because of that flood.
You
know, just to sort of help people, we just went through a flood that, you know, the reality went on for the worst for about a week and a half. How long did this flood last?
Well, on the lower Mississippi, the serious flooding began in February and ended in the middle of June.
So we're talking 6 months or 5 months.
Yes.
For all practical purposes.
Yes. I mean, the most severe was in April and May.
This impact on Hoover and sort of catapulting him to the presidency, did it also have an effect on attitudes about what people thought the federal government should do?
Exactly. As I said a minute ago, the federal government paid not a penny for 700,000 people being fed. And at the time, I mean, across the nation, there was this idea that maybe the federal government should take some responsibility for its citizens in a disaster that large. In fact, there's in Louisiana in 1922, 5 years earlier, there was another flood with 35,000 people homeless. And the governor at the time said Louisiana has not asked for aid and will not. He was too proud to ask for aid. 5 years later, things were different.
Thank you. We're out of time. I really enjoyed reading it. Very, very well written. Thank you for
very
joining
much.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We leave you this morning with a selection from one of Broadway's all-time favorite musicals. Carousel runs through this coming week at the Aronoff Theater. Enjoy.